Okay, we're a couple of minutes early, so I think we will hang on a few minutes just because some people are going to join specifically to hear Sheena Cruickshank's talk. But while we're waiting, thought I should put up this important slide. As declaration of interest, I've had 3 COVID vaccinations, 2 Pfizer and 1 Johnson & Johnson. And you can see what that's done to me. I've got this COVID-19 5G chip implanted in my brain, and my telephone reception is absolutely outstanding. And this has been around the internet quite a lot, actually, and it's been quite influential in the US. Could I have the next slide? People always, if Peter can push us on one, people always laugh at Twitter. Well, but it has been actually really invaluable in keeping up with new stuff, particularly on vaccines, as it happens, which is an incredibly rapidly changing field. And I just recommend everyone who is on Twitter to follow Hilda Bastian, who's an Australian immunologist. And you can see she's done 31,000 tweets, which is probably more than Donald Trump ever manages. And at the bottom of that slide, there's something she's come up with today, which is an extraordinary huge review on current evidence about vaccines and what's happening. So although people mock Twitter a lot, it is a really good, can be a really good way of keeping up with what's happening. Could I have the next one? And then people say, well, it's got to be peer reviewed and everything. So this paper has just come out in the last couple of weeks in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is regarded as one of the top journals in the world, and it's generally admitted to be complete nonsense. So if you're a member of the National Academy of Sciences, there's a fast track approach. You can get your paper whizzed in and published in this amazing high impact journal. And what it's actually saying or claiming is that after you've had a SARS infection, the viral RNA can integrate into your genome. And if you have a vaccine, if you have the Pfizer one, this can also integrate into your genome. And it also explains positive PCR tests, which are going around at the moment, because they're false positives from RNA, which you have thoughtlessly integrated into your genome, and it's being picked up in PCR tests. So, okay, this is in one of the top journals, and it's been politely trashed by other virologists, but you also cannot rely on peer-reviewed journals as well. Just one more, I think. Is there one more? Oh, yes, I'd like to give I don't know if Sheena is going to mention her, but I like this woman. She, not just for her work on vaccines, but she's just an amazing person, sort of poet and God knows what, and just completely out of her time. So she was married to she refused to marry the person her father wanted her to marry, married a British ambassador to Istanbul or Constantinople. And this is one of her letters she wrote back, talking about the variolation, do you pronounce it? Or anyway, inoculation of, which was apparently pretty routine in Istanbul at the time. And it's actually 300 years ago that she tried, almost exactly 300 years ago, that she inoculated her daughter when she'd come back to England. And it got a kind of mixed reception. The daughter was fine, but it was an amazing piece of work which gets periodically rediscovered every 10 or 20 years. And then on this day, actually, in 1796, Jenner did his more famous experiment. So all this is by way of a preamble and gets us nicely up to 3 o'clock. And I'd like to introduce our last speaker. It's really appropriate to finish on vaccines, I think. The undisputed and completely unexpected success story of this pandemic, or global pandemic, as people like to call it. So Sheena Cruickshank is an immunologist and professor of biomedical sciences, and also works on public engagement and science communication at the University of Manchester. in particular focusing on immune responses of the gut. So, and inflammatory bowel disease. So today she's going to give us an overview on the whole process of vaccination and what it means and why it's developed the way it is. I don't think it's going to be an epitope kind of based talk, but just I hope it isn't. It's going to be the whole field of vaccination, I think, and how it's taken off. So, Sheena, over to you. Or Peter, hopefully, will play your talk from now, and we'll be doing questions at the end.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for the invitation to talk. I'm going to be talking about the development of vaccines, taking you all the way back to the dim and distant past of variolation and to where we are now when we're fighting against COVID. To start with, I thought I should give you a little bit of a kind of introduction into immunology, because I know it's not everybody's favorite subject. And the idea of our immune response is it's evolved to be able to deal with a whole plethora of different infections. And the scale at which it can do this is absolutely astounding. So it's all the way down to viruses here on the left, which are nanometers big, through to parasitic worms, which are amongst the biggest organisms we ever deal with, which may be as long as 9 or 10 meters. Yet somehow our immune system can deal with this complexity of these variety of different organisms and these sizes of different organisms. And of course it does this because we've got a huge variety of different cell types that are able to recognize infection in different ways and cooperate together to deal with them. So here is just a sort of summary of how the immune system. On the left-hand side, you've got our innate immune cells. These are our first responders. They're able to quickly start dealing with the infection. They recognize a threat, and they will start to try and control that threat. But part of that innate immune system will then bridge into a more adaptive, a more intelligent part of the immune system, which is called the adaptive immune system. You see, immunologists are really imaginative with their naming. And that's really primarily represented by our lymphocytes, our B lymphocytes and our T lymphocytes. And it's these that we're particularly interested in the context of immunity and vaccination. So this just shows you how innate and adaptive immunity work together. So in the healthy host situation, you've got a steady state. The immune system is monitoring, but it's not actually dealing with a threat. Then if you become infected, you need to initiate the immune response, which is primarily done, of course, by the innate immune response. It takes time before the adaptive immune system starts to come into play. So it takes a little while before we get our B and our T cells going. Once you resolve the immune response, any subsequent protection will be covered primarily by the adaptive response, and it's what we call a memory response. And this just shows you in cartoon form how powerful that memory response is. So if we see on the left-hand side, we can see protective immunity represented by the curve showing you antibody or T cells, which are two indications of protective adaptive immunity. You can see it takes a little while to get going, and it's not that strong. The magnitude of the response is relatively weak. Whereas with the memory response, it takes much less time to get going, and the magnitude of the response is much better. It's bigger, it's better, and it's stronger. And that is because the immune system has been trained. It knows how to deal with the threat this time. It doesn't have to do all that learning. It's a bit like swatting for an exam, short-term memory versus the long-term memory that really helps you deal with things. Now, the risk of all of this setup of initiating adaptive immunity, of course, is you can get very, very unwell while all this is happening. And so this is really where vaccination comes into. Can we create this memory response? Can we create immunity without actually having a full-blown infection? And surprisingly, this idea of protecting has one that's been around for a very, very long time. Now, we do have some accounts of vaccination type strategies all the way back from around the 10th century in countries such as China. However, the most credible account comes from the 1500s. And this is a lovely image that kind of shows you that. So you can see on the left-hand side, you can see there is a chap and he's been infected with smallpox. So you can see the pustules on him. What he then does is he then lances one of his pustules and drains the content, which is what he's doing in the third panel. He can then take a little bit of this pustule content and he can use that to inoculate somebody else to protect them from the infection. This is called variolation. And this is a very, very crude form of vaccination. And this is something that stayed on the other side of the world for really quite some time. And it only came to the UK thanks to this lady here, who I am showing you at the moment because I'm just showing you the variolation tools. These are just the variolation tools just to highlight. It's really quite graphic. So these sort of lances that they use, and this is a close-up of the smallpox pustules. So this is not a nice or very accurate process. And here is the lady now who actually introduced it into the UK. It's Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and she introduced the practice of variolation into the UK in 1717. She had been living out in Persia, and she observed these practices of variolation. Now, smallpox was something that had affected her quite personally. Not only had she had it herself and it had marred her beauty, but she'd actually lost a child to the infection. So she was really, really aware of smallpox. And when she was at the baths, she saw other ladies were doing this practice of variolation with their children. They were talking about it and they were practicing it. So she sort of investigated it a little bit, and then she decided to try and variolate her own children, which she did, and it was successful. And then when she came back to the UK, she introduced it more widely. However, it didn't really take off. Although she had some influence because she was very wealthy and educated, it was still considered a bit of a foreign practice, and she was a woman, and this is long before the era of women's rights. So this is not something that came into wider practice. And it has to be said, as you can imagine from seeing those tools and smallpox pustules, it wasn't always very safe. Variolation still had around a 1% death rate. And Edward Jenner, of course, in 1796, then took it one stage further by creating the first vaccine. But he was still using a variolation tactic. This time he was using cowpox to protect against smallpox. It turns out that cowpox is related to smallpox, and he observed that people who had cowpox infection were subsequently protected from later infection. So he inoculated a small boy first with some cowpox using the same sort of strategy that was used in variolation, and of course it turned out to be successful, and this is where vaccination really kind of grew and grew. But it has to be said they had no clue as to how it was working. And that is because the ideas of infection were really pretty basic at that point. There were still ideas of miasma, this idea that it was foul air that was causing you to be infected. And, you know, perhaps that's something we can sympathize at the moment as we're all in the middle of an airborne pandemic. However, of course, as you will know, that is not how infections are acquired. And the idea of germ theory kind of grew and grew. And I think Louis Pasteur helped bring the field forward quite substantially. So he was looking at developing vaccines by weakening pathogens, which we now call attenuation. So he particularly looked at rabies and anthrax and successfully developed some vaccines there. And then Robert Koch subsequently followed up that work and is really credited with the kind of the movement of germ theory and this wider acceptance that it was sort of organisms that were driving infectious organisms. Of course, developments in kind of bacteriology, virology, etc., all came after that. However, although these vaccinations were being given, they didn't know how they were working. And immunology was still not really an idea. And it wasn't until around 1882 that Elie Metchnikoff did his groundbreaking work where he came up with this idea of phagocytosis and the idea of cells engulfing pathogens. And he's really credited now with as being the kind of father of immunology. The transfer of immunity ideas, which links to antibodies, came a little later, around 1890, with Emil von Berg and Catasto, who were looking at the sort of using serum to passively immunize non-infected animals, which is really about observations around antibodies. And it was Paul Ehrlich who then went and discovered antibodies and came up with the theories around antibodies. But as to what cells produce them and how we became immune, that wasn't really known probably until the 60s with Jacques Miller, who is credited as not only being probably one of the last people in the world to discover an organ, because he discovered the thymus, which is where T cells develop, but he also subsequently showed the development of discrete cells, the T and the B cells, which of course we now know are critical for immunity. So just to put that in context, we were making vaccines long before we knew there was pathogens and way before we knew there was an immune system. But of course, subsequently, this pioneering sort of attitude and work by these scientists has enabled vaccine development to really develop and evolve. And we've got lots and lots of modern vaccines. They've been highly successful. They work on the same principle. They're all generating protective antibodies and inducing T and B cell memory. So this shows you back from the 50s, and of course, Boris Johnson here in 2021. Design a vaccine, you need two major components. You need what we call antigens. These are unique features of the target pathogen. That is what the lymphocytes, the B and the T cells, recognize. So you can provide those to the host, or you can make the host generate them themselves. That's absolutely critical. You need the antigens. And then you also need an infection signal. This is something that's going to alert and activate the host immune system, because otherwise it will not react. So if you're taking something like the sorts of things Jenner and Pasteur were doing, these live and attenuated vaccines, you've naturally got both signals. However, some of the more modern vaccine platforms may provide, for example, the antigen, but they will not provide the infection signal. So we have ways that we can try and make that better. For example, giving booster shots, or we can add some chemicals or formulations that we call adjuvants that basically act as an infection signal. So they tell the immune system that it needs to do something. And there are around 5 main vaccine designs. The earliest ones are the ones that we've already discussed, led by obviously Pasteur and Jennings. So these are related, less harmful infections, which are very difficult to find in practice. I think the only other example I can think of is the BCG bacteria, which is related to TB. Of course, the disadvantage of these is you are giving somebody an infection. So if they haven't got a good immune system, this is going to be quite dangerous. The live attenuated pathogens are going to give you less of an infection because you've weakened the pathogen. However, there is still a risk if you have an immunocompromised state. And these definitely represent older types of vaccine. The next sort of leap was really developing killed or inactivated infections. So here you grow the pathogen in culture in some way, and then you kill it, for example, with heat, with chemicals, or with radiation. And it basically, now you've got like an empty shell that has all the features but is not infectious anymore. There is a small risk of disease because if the pathogen hasn't been properly inactivated. And so for this reason, they will often require the boosters and or the adjuvant. You need that infection signal. But they are relatively simple to produce. And we probably know this best as our influenza vaccines. Many of our influenza vaccines, we use this strategy. And actually, some of the COVID vaccines are using this strategy. For example, the Sinovac COVID-19 vaccine, although that is not currently licensed in this country. Protein subunits are the next level along, and that's by understanding the immune response to the pathogen. So now you're able to select the antigen that's best going to stimulate the immune response. These are relatively easy to bulk up and supply once you've defined it. So hepatitis B vaccine is a good example of this, and a vaccine that's not actually being used clinically yet for COVID, but I think is in phase 3 trials at the moment, is the Novavax vaccine. And this looks like it's quite effective in the clinical trials. It seems to be producing good levels of neutralizing antibody. And it had around 90 to 96% efficacy against the original and UK variants of COVID. However, the effectiveness does seem to have dropped to around 50% with the South African variant. And that's because changes in the features of the South African variant mean that the antigen isn't quite similar enough between the two platforms. Recombinant viral vectored ones are probably ones that you're very familiar with now, and some of you may well have had it. I know I have. These are where you bioengineer a virus to express the target pathogen antigens in vivo. And they are very widely investigated. They've got good safety profiles. The Ebola vaccine that was developed used this type of approach, and of course the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine has used this, and Johnson & Johnson's one. So the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, of course, has had a good level of efficacy. It's showing good levels of T and B cell responses. It's really cheap to manufacture, and it's really easy to store. Storage is not such a problem, and that can be really, really important when you're trying to think about distribution of vaccines, particularly in low-income countries. However, it may not be as effective against the variants, again, because of what it's targeting. A lot of the vaccines that I'm now describing are really focused on the S protein of COVID. This is the bit of the virus that uses to latch onto host cells. So the idea is you're trying to block it from getting into the cells. And of course, there's been a lot of publicity about this these particular vaccines, the AstraZeneca one and also the Johnson & Johnson one, where there's been concern that they may be causing blood clots in rare cases, which of course is currently being investigated. The Sputnik 5 vaccine that Russia have produced also uses a similar platform, but here they've made a recombinant virus as the vector to carry it, because they've spliced a little bit of human cold virus alongside a bit of monkey virus to create their platform. And finally, and last but not least, we have the absolute marvel that is the nucleic acid mRNA vaccines. It can be DNA, but mRNA vaccines are what we're aware of. And I feel like I have to kind of side topic into the lady who really pioneered this, because I think it's really important to be aware of her history. So Katalin Karikó, I'm sorry if I've not pronounced that correctly, she was the one who really came up with this idea, and she started writing grants on this topic in 1990. She had so many grants, so many papers rejected. She was in line to become a professor, and with all of these failures in grants and papers, she actually got demoted. Yet, of course, she is now credited with developing and pioneering mRNA vaccines. Her persistence absolutely paid off. And so it's just a lesson that sometimes the ideas that seem the most groundbreaking, sometimes it is worth persisting with them. And I'm really, of course, I think we're all really, really pleased that she did persist with them. So here the idea is what you're able to do is you can encode many antigens, you can even encode the whole genome pathogens into a complex. So you encode the mRNA, or it could be the DNA, with a carrier such as lipid, and that's what's used in the biotech Pfizer vaccines. This is then enables this sort of liposome to get into the target cells, which will then transiently express the protein and trigger the immune response. It's completely non-infectious. It should be quite cheap to manufacture and bulk up. However, of course, it does seem to have transport and stability issues. I think the Moderna seems to be a little bit less sensitive than the Pfizer vaccine, but they are looking like they're quite expensive at the moment. However, they do seem to be remarkably effective, showing a really high level of efficacy. And the design is really quite easy to kind of tweak, again, if you want to change the target. So what the UK has done is the UK has invested in several of these different vaccine platforms simultaneously. And the advantage of that was that we weren't putting all our eggs in one basket. So if only one type of vaccine came through, we could miss out. We actually had lots of opportunity to get lots of different types of vaccine. And this was taken from the UK Government and Press Office conference earlier this week, and they're just highlighting how positive they think the impacts against COVID have been using vaccination. They think there could be a 55 to 70% reduction in symptomatic disease. We're definitely getting good evidence that you're either asymptomatic if you get infected again, or very, very much less ill. And of course, that then translates into a substantial decrease in hospitalization, and again, a substantial decrease in deaths. What isn't on this slide is there also seems to be good evidence for several of these vaccines that they were reducing the ability of us to transmit the infection if we become infected after we become vaccines. So the transmission reducing as well. So this is absolutely fantastic and shows you the power of vaccines. And of course, where they're used, they're hugely successful. And this just gives you a cartoon of some of the amazing results that there have been. This is in the US, showing results in vaccination where they're used. But we don't have vaccines for all diseases. Not all diseases are particularly easy to vaccinate against. These are examples of some of the things that we haven't got vaccines for, or successful vaccines. This is a schistosome parasite, and it's actually a parasite pair, and this causes several hundreds of thousands of deaths per year, has a huge impact on health and well-being. And there is no vaccine for it at the moment, and quite a lot of the parasitic diseases we lack vaccines for. This is HIV, still no vaccine for that, despite this disease having lived in the human population for some time. We don't even have a vaccine for the viruses that cause the human common cold. And even though a lot of these conditions are not fatal for the majority of healthy people, they still have a big income sort of cost on lives and well-being, and they can be very serious in people with very weak immune systems. This image here actually shows you malaria parasitizing a red blood cell and non-infected red blood cells clustering around it. There's been a lot of efforts into developing a vaccine to malaria, and it's been very difficult to do. We're close, but there is not a standard vaccine for malaria yet. There's some really good candidates that are getting there, but that has taken a good 20 or so years plus work. So why does this happen? Well, some of these infections are very complex, so we don't fully understand the life cycle. We might not understand how the immune response generated works and recognizes these things. So for example, You might get different immune responses at different stages of the pathogen's life. Some of the pathogens that I've showed you there can vary their features, and that makes it problematic to design a vaccine. There may be very poor models to look at the disease, and there can be real issues around lack of research. For example, Zika really took people by surprise. This was a disease that they knew about, but it was quite rare. But then because of things like climate change, it was able to spill out into lots of other countries. And it was only when you saw a lot of people being infected that they realized there were some really serious side effects of being infected with Zika. And of course, Ebola was another one that when it kind of grew out of just quite a localized disease, again, we weren't prepared for it. And I think we're in the middle of a pandemic with a novel coronavirus, so we are definitely seeing it right now. And then even if you do have a vaccine, you've got to think about how much it costs, how easy it is to store, how easy it is to transport, and whether or not all the countries are going to be able to relatively easily access it. So there's lots and lots of complex reasons that make vaccines difficult. And of course, when you do have them, you don't get them taken up. So this is just some data that shows you, taken from 2015, the proportion of people who think vaccines across the world are safe. So the red shows you people who strongly agree, so that's 0 to 29. So the blue areas are the ones where you've got a lot of people strongly agreeing. And what you can see is by 2018, the blue is fading and there's more and more kind of pinky reddy bits coming up. There is a lot of vaccine unsureness. I don't think that's very good English, but it lets you get the idea. And although he's not solely responsible for it, Andrew Wakefield has had a big part to play in modern vaccine hesitancy and fears. Back in 1998, he of course hypothesized that the MMR vaccine was linked to autism. His work was subsequently proved fraudulent and unethical, and he was disbarred for his practices. However, despite the work being retracted, despite him being disbarred, this legacy has persisted. And this rise of vaccine hesitancy, the anti-vax movement, has really kind of taken hold from his work, I would say. It's not solely responsible for it. And this has caused a remarkable reduction in vaccine uptake. And it's also taken money away from studies that should perhaps not have been done, or, you know, studies that could have been done and they're never going to be done because so much money's been spent. So there's been so many studies since that have tried to replicate his findings, including studies that have been funded by anti-vaccination campaigns. And no study has replicated those findings that he came up with in 1998. And people with autism have actually got quite frustrated with it, and there has been a movement saying, if you actually invest some of that money in us, you could improve our lives and our well-being rather than putting all this money into this vaccine research to debunk. It's much harder to debunk than it is to prove something. So as a little snapshot, over 80,000 people in 47 of the European countries contracted measles in 2018. This is a disease that we were on the point of eradicating. And in 2019, over 140,000 people died of measles, and that is completely preventable. And the World Health Organization has said that vaccine hesitancy is one of our 10 biggest global threats to health. So this is very, very serious. And this shows you kind of some of the headlines that you see. This is one of the ones I was referring to, where an anti-vaxxer group managed to fund a study that debunked the autism link. Teens defying their parents and having to fight with their parents so they could get a vaccine. A young child who developed tetanus and had to spend 57 days at the point of death in hospital. It cost $800,000 to treat that child, and his parents still refused to get him vaccinated. and then this coordination around social media to try and spread anti-vax movement. So there's two kind of groups. There's the anti-vaxxers. These are people who are wholly opposed to vaccinations. They are a minority, but they're remarkably well organised and well funded. Then vaccine hesitant describe the majority of those people who are unhappy with vaccines or unsure about vaccines. They're questioning, they're on the fence, they're not sure. And that's all reasonable, but sometimes they're not the people that we end up talking to, which is a shame because they're the people we most need to talk to. And this just shows you this sort of preponderance of social media and influencing it. So the anti-vax clusters are down here. These are the pro-vaccine clusters, and all the green are interspersed. And you can see how there's networks going between the two and how easy it is to get influenced. And with pro-vaccine groups, it's a very simple message. Vaccines work, they save lives. Whereas anti-vaccine narratives can be really numerous. They can play on worries about children's health. They can advocate alternative medicines and well-being. They could link to conspiracy theories. So there's lots of different ways people can get drawn into these. And because these messages are spread against many more Facebook, for example, this is Facebook clusters, than the pro-vaccine groups, they're able to influence. And once you start going down one kind of avenue, you end up opening lots and lots of others. So this is research taken in 2020, so it's quite up to date. The main themes are to do with controlling your body, how we want to parent, we want to be more natural. Perhaps this perception is shaped by a bad experience you've had of healthcare, and you become very wary about healthcare. And this is thought to be one of the really big drivers with, for example, some groups are avoiding vaccination because there's the real concerns about how they've been treated in the past by the healthcare sector. They might misunderstand the risk versus the benefit, so they might think the vaccine is more harmful than the risk of the disease. There's been a lot of this blowing up with some of the information that came out about the potential of blood clots, even though you were more likely to get a blood clot if you actually got COVID than you were if you got the AstraZeneca vaccine. Fear of chemicals that they think might be in the vaccine. Lots of stuff around this, even though a lot of these chemicals are not actually put into vaccines. And just general distrust of government agencies and corporations. So there's all sorts of things that can be happening. And even if you could persuade all the people that vaccination was a good thing, the biggest issue that we also face today is access and equality. Not everybody is being able to access the vaccines, and we've seen it here in the UK. We've seen battles between the EU and the UK fighting over the vaccines and threatening to block vaccines being released from Europe. India, which is one of the big centres for vaccine manufacture, put a pause on vaccine deliveries while they focused on efforts within their own country. And this is taken from 8th of April, where AstraZeneca are threatening to sue them because they're not getting their vaccines out to other countries and they've got commitments. So this is just one of the things if you've got the money. But a lot of countries don't have the money. High and upper income countries represent 53% of the world's population. They have received so far 83% of the vaccines to COVID. The low and lower middle income countries represent 47% and have only received 17% of the vaccines. And that was data taken from May the 11th, 2021. So if you see countries like Israel are doing really, really well with their vaccine campaigns, although interestingly, they haven't been vaccinating people of Palestinian origin who live in Israel still, or some of the areas. I'm not going to get into that. The UK is doing well. US is rapidly accelerating, but what we're seeing now Is vaccines being returned in certain states because there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy? And it's been estimated at this rate, it could take us until 2023 before we could vaccinate everybody. And of course, the risk of that is it enables COVID clusters to really spread, which we are unfortunately seeing. We've seen in Brazil, we're seeing South Africa, we're seeing in India at the moment. It's absolutely horrific in India. And that also enables variants to emerge, which makes the vaccines less effective. And it isn't just COVID. There's a really unfortunate impact of all of this concentration on COVID. It's been estimated by the WHO that over 170 million children are now at risk of missing out on their measles vaccines. And that's because of the focus on COVID. It's not being able to get into areas because it's not safe to travel bans, etc. And this map just visualizes, so you can see all the areas highlighted in blue show you some of the places that are at risk of not getting their measles vaccines. So this is something that really takes cooperation at a world level. So what I've tried to do is just give you a little snapshot in the evolution and the development of vaccines. And we're still evolving and developing vaccines. We're still refining and improving and bettering what we're able to do. And all of this is enabled by the fact that we have such a better knowledge of immunology, we have a better knowledge of virology, bacteriology, etc. Unfortunately, vaccine misinformation is also evolving and developing alongside this, and we really have an urgent need to tackle the misinformation, working within communities to better promote health awareness and in partnership with those communities. And we have a really big need. We have to sort of look at this issue of vaccine distribution and manufacture. It's the only way we're going to start getting ahead of the curve in this pandemic, but maybe even a future pandemic. And on that note, I would like to leave it there and say thank you very much for listening. I do have this video clip.
It was an amazing talk. I always thought immunology and communication and clarity were mutually exclusive, but you've proved us wrong. Actually, a lot of people have been tweeting and messaging me personally, saying how much they've enjoyed the talk, and they're sending it on to their friends. It's I'd almost forgotten about Andrew Wakefield and the way he the way the whole thing started from something relatively trivial that you thought, I mean, I originally thought he just massaged his figures to say that he had this group of patients, you know, in his clinic. And that was probably the end of it. And now he's gone completely going around the world, actually a full anti-vaxxer, which is an amazing metamorphosis, really, I think. And do you really think he has had a huge influence on, particularly on measles, on the MMR and the reduction in take-up?
Well, sadly, yes, I do. He gave some, I guess, some credibility to people who were already concerned about vaccines, and you know, he's still there, and you know, the way they kind of paint him and some other sort of people in his orbit is that they're you know, they're being ostracized, that they're right, and the medical field are kind of, you know, making them victims. So they really paint themselves as victims, even though, you know, he'll probably be getting paid tens of thousands of pounds to do various appearances and things, whereas the likes of the immunologists who are actually doing the work will get paid nothing for doing appearances. So he's profiting very, very much from it. And there's a lot of sort of big names in media who are supporting him. But vaccine hesitancy has been with us all the way through. You only have to look at those lovely Punch cartoons of you know, the very early vaccines where they thought the cowpox was going to be emerging from their face, and anywhere that they got vaccinated. So there's always been anti-vaccination movements. What we've never had is this ability to mobilize through social media. And they did some research, and they showed that there was only about 3 groups or 3 individuals that were actually financing and developing the majority of the misinformation. One of those is Robert Kennedy's group. So he's very well financed in it. So it's a very, very small group of individuals who are remarkably well financed. So I think you can possibly see my son playing football in the garden. See these reflections.
Well, as long as he's playing for Manchester City, you're excused. Can you say something about vaccine sharing or lack of sharing across different countries and how COVAX is going? I thought it's quite interesting that China seems to have been giving away a remarkably effective vaccine to, I think Chile in particular has, and it's remarkably effective, but the way it's portrayed is anything China does at the moment is bad. But on the other hand, compared to what we're doing, you could say it's good.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the good things we did do was with the AstraZeneca vaccine, because that was developed as a not-for-profit vaccine with a view that it could go to income poor countries, and that is absolutely critical. Unfortunately, some of the vaccines are really, really expensive, and they have these huge storage issues, and that is not going to make them suitable for these countries. But I do think actually long-term something that we actually need to think about better, because we need to have a system that enables greater mobilization and sharing of these resources rather than hoarding. The sort of wealthier countries have got more vaccines than they can need, they can use. I've got colleagues in the States who are helping out at vaccine clinics, and they're sending back vaccines because the vaccines are being turned away now, because vaccine hesitancy and anti-vax is really starting to hit in the age groups that are being targeted, and we're starting to see that in the UK. I got vaccinated early because of that. That I was able to get that because the vaccines were about to go off, and they just did a quick panic in the next age groups. So we'll get more vaccines are going with the situation in India. There are more vaccines being released. The US has released some vaccines. We have released a few, but we have a long, long, long way to go. And there's countries like Brazil that are really not getting much coverage, but that's partly because of the political situation as well. So it's really bad. It's really bad, and we need to be doing better because we can't protect everybody. We can't protect ourselves until we protect everybody.
Yeah, when we started, I was telling people, well, that I guessed that there wouldn't be a successful vaccine because people have been trying to do, as you mentioned, a common cold one. And I was thinking back to Tyrol and the cold research unit and everything. And some of the vaccines, which are quite effective, are just straight heat-killed things, which seem to have at least some protection, if not this 90% protection. So I wonder why we never got a common cold vaccine. Was it just lack of resource or interest, or a peculiar quirk of biology, do you think?
Well, so with the common cold, it's actually, there's at least 3 virus families that cause the common cold. You got the rhinoviruses, the adenoviruses, and the coronaviruses. And then even within those, you're getting quite a lot of rapid mutations and switches. And so, for example, if we take some of the coronaviruses that cause the common cold, we know that for whatever reason, we also don't seem to see a long-term immunity to them. So we're immune for a while, and it seems to decline. And this is another feature that can make vaccinating some diseases problematic. So when you've got multiple families of disease causing a condition, when you've got them changing the features frequently, and when you don't fully understand the immune response, because you don't understand why it isn't necessarily long-term, why it's not necessarily lasting, that's the kind of perfect storm scenario. And at least with influenza, where we've got at least 2 viral families driving disease, we do understand the immune response much better, and we understand the viruses quite well, so we can understand and predict what's going to be happening with them and which viral families are likely to predominate which year, although obviously we still get these new pandemics coming in, particularly when we get zoonotic infections.
Yeah, I don't know what will happen with the next year's flu vaccinations, as it doesn't seem to be a lot around to base the next panel on. But anyway,
yeah, that could be a real problem, couldn't it? And we still don't get enough uptake of them, even when they're free for a lot of people.
Yeah. There was a question which you haven't seen. It's come into me about quite an interesting one about, is it the very speed that the way these vaccines have been developed has caused some of the fear and worry about uptake of them. You know, the whole process is quite hard to comprehend in a way, isn't it? It's just gone so quickly.
I think speed is an issue. I've heard a lot of people say, well, I want to wait till they've tested it properly. And I guess it's difficult to understand the kind of laborious, painful process that we normally have in vaccine trials, because often, you know, you're trying to fund phase 1, and then you're trying to fund phase 2. So you're kind of having to do every step in between, and every time you're trying to get funding, you're trying to publish the data before you can get the next bit of funding. You're also trying to recruit the volunteers. All of these things can take an inordinately long time. What we had was phase 1, phase 2 often being combined. So we've done the pre-safety things. Phase 1, phase 2 was combined. Then we just had people lined up. There was you know, lists of vaccine volunteers ready to take part in the trials. That never happens. You never get that kind of cooperation. You had already the cooperation inbuilt between different countries in order to sort of look at different endemic populations. Also, the virus was around. You have to really start testing things in endemic populations. So, for example, that slowed the Ebola trials down, because it was difficult to really test how effective it was when you haven't got the disease actively circulating. So all the same things have happened, but they've happened in a much shorter time. Plus, we already had pretty good understanding of that virus, not specifically SARS-CoV-2, but we had a good understanding of some of the other beta coronaviruses, and there's been quite a lot of work looking at SARS and also MERS. So a lot of that understanding was folded into it. And if you've already got the platform, you've got some understanding, there you go. And of course, China released the sequence very, very quickly. So this is why we're at where we're at, I think.
There was one thing I found helping out at my local vaccine centre was the older people are quite really positive and bouncy insofar as they can bounce as they come into the centre for their vaccination. But a couple of people have said to me, I don't tell my son that I've come here for a vaccination because he'd kill me. Well, not literally, but it's odd that this hesitancy does seem to be the young, and it's not just that they're less likely to be affected. It's a real skepticism about what's being inflicted on them. Have you got any opinions or clues about that?
Well, I think, again, it comes down to some of the issues about perceived risk, not understanding the risk of the disease versus the risk of the vaccine. Also, it tends to be younger people who will perhaps be using more of the social media sites, and this is really where a lot of the misinformation and the sort of anti-vaxxers are kind of propagating their efforts. And once you start on that kind of that journey into sort of from vaccine hesitancy into vaccine skepticism, it's like a tunnel that you go down, and you're seeing more and more things that are going to tell you that they're bad. It's like an echo chamber. You're in a completely different place to somebody who's telling you, oh, the vaccines are safe, and people hold on to those ideas. People don't like to be told they're wrong. So when you're trying to have conversations with vaccine hesitant people, you have to really come at come at it from a very different perspective. You can't just say, well, you're wrong, you're being stupid, because that just makes them switch off. So you have to come at them from a very much more open perspective and say, well, why do you think like that? Where are you getting that information? And find out what's behind it, and then you can start to kind of probe in. But it's quite tricky to do.
So even in Europe, there seems to be a huge difference in vaccine acceptability. There was an astonishing figure of, I think it's only 21% of people in France, said anything positive about a vaccine. I think that was only a few months ago, which seems a staggeringly low figure. I mean, now they seem to be queuing up for the vaccine, but to come out with, just a figure of 21%, would you be willing to take a vaccine? Seems incredible. Because people tend to say, well, Europeans are quite sophisticated and Americans are a bit stupid, and other countries, they're all a bit silly, but we Europeans are quite sophisticated. But still a huge variation in different European countries. Is that a historic thing? Do you have any knowledge about that?
Yeah, there's been quite a few studies that have been done on that, and I think there's been sort of historically a lot of mistrust of government agencies. There were some issues, I think, with one of the pandemics where I think it was the French government kind of bulk bought a lot of anti-flu drugs, cost a lot of money, they weren't used, and this sort of built up bad feeling. There was also some discussion, I think it was the human papillomavirus vaccine, where there was some people who said it was causing conditions. This was subsequently debunked, but that is circulated, that narrative is circulated, and there was a court case about that. So you get these issues that kind of come, and the memory holds, and it's much, much harder to prove something's not true than it is to say, to sort of just come up with something. And of course, in Italy, it was part of the political campaign. The current party, the ruling party, ran on an anti-vaccination campaign. So, that. I mean, that wasn't their sort of policy, but that was one of their overriding kind of things that they believed in and they held. So it just shows you that it's very, very different. There's cultural differences. So yeah, it's very complicated.
There's a few comments saying excellent presentation, but that doesn't really, which is true. But here's a question: what do you think will be the effect on the vaccine development for other diseases? Now we have these rapid methods. Do you think we'll either be shamed or pushed into developing them quicker in some way?
I would really like to think that there would be more positivity, and we would see some of these vaccines get developed more quickly. Realistically, I don't actually think that's going to happen, unfortunately. I'd love to say it is, but the UK government have just taken the decision to dramatically cut the science budget, particularly for things that are to do with international work. And a lot of the emerging diseases that are becoming diseases of concern that cause pandemics actually do come from this sort of emerging disease monitoring, surveillance, treatment work. I mean, Ebola was obviously a concern, but we saw Zika was a huge concern. That's something that's arisen. We've had MERS, we've had SARS, we've had SARS-CoV-2, and some of the flu pandemics. All that research is being cut, the budget into that. And this is also having a huge effect on other basic science funding, because there's this huge deficit in one massive pot of money, and they are taking it from other existing grants. So no, I don't think. I think we've got the wherewithal, we've got the technology, we've got the science brains, and we do a lot with not very much money here in the UK. But unfortunately, we're being hamstringed. Sorry, okay. That was a bit political, but
slightly gloomy note to finish on. But thank you very much for a really clear and fascinating presentation. Thank you. So we're at the end of our week, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as we have in preparing the thing and listening to it. I just want to do one more thank you to Val Bevan, who's our chair and who's been the main organizer and responsible for keeping us all on the straight and narrow and harassing speakers and presenters to make sure they do what they said they would do. I don't want to give any more thank yous because it tends to turn into a kind of Oscars, but we should thank her for all her hard work. Just to say, this is the first webinar we've done, and we'd like to know what you think about it. Basically, should we do more, for example, specific webinars on narrow topics like respiratory tract infections or blood cultures or anything? Because it is quite a simple format, relatively, compared to organizing a face-to-face meeting. Or should we alternate webinars with face-to-face meetings? If you want to email into the BSMT, we'd love to hear your suggestions, and things we've done wrong. They're really helpful. If you can put them politely, that would be great and really helpful. So I'll sign off now. We are 49 seconds over time, and I hope you've enjoyed the meeting. All the stuff will be on the web, and we'll keep you informed of any future developments. Thank you very much for listening.